Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories on the latest debate over gun control and upcoming primary election season. I'll then join the Center Square executive editor Dan McCaleb to further discuss the news. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Are you looking for fair news coverage out of the nation's capital? Join the Center Square's editor-in-chief Dan McCaleb and D.C. Bureau Chief Casey Harper as they discuss all things coming out of Washington, D.C.
And as you said, I did a fact check on this because I really found it pretty misleading. Gas prices, yes, are down. But if you look at food prices, they increased.
No spin, just the news. Listen to the America in Focus podcast at americastalking.com or wherever you get your podcast.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Here's some of the top stories from the past week. While the timing of the 7th Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals' decision on a challenge to Illinois' gun and magazine ban is unclear, it's expected to go to the U.S. Supreme Court. Tuesday, Governor J.B. Pritzker said he's heartened after last week's appeal court hearing, citing some of the judge's questions focused on whether the issue is a, quote, popularity contest with which guns were going to be allowed.
Because the people who are advocating for semi-automatic weapons were saying, well, gee, everybody's got one now, so you can't ban them. Well, that's ridiculous. If everybody had a missile launcher, we shouldn't ban missile launchers.
Todd Vandermeide, who's been consulting one of the plaintiffs' groups, said that the case isn't about missile launchers.
They just keep jumping to the absurd that if you allow rifles, shotguns, and pistols, then you have to allow all this other stuff. And nobody is arguing. That's not even before the court in any way.
If the law is upheld, Illinoisans who own certain semi-automatic firearms obtained before the ban will have to register them with the state police by January 1st. Darren Bailey, the former Illinois state senator who was defeated in his challenge to incumbent Governor J.B. Pritzker last November, announced he's running for Congress. Kevin Bessler has that story.
Bailey will challenge five-term incumbent GOP Representative Mike Bost, who represents 34 Southern Illinois counties in the 12th District.
Let us declare with a resounding voice that we will not allow our freedoms to be trampled on. We will not be silenced. We will not surrender. Together, we will take back our country.
Bailey is a Clay County farmer whose run for governor was endorsed by former President Donald Trump, and Bost is a five-term congressman who was also endorsed by Trump. In a statement Tuesday, Bost's campaign manager said it was a shame that Bailey would make a run and divide conservatives. I'm Kevin Bessler.
In general terms, Republican State Senator Steve McClure said he's keeping an eye on such instances around the state of Republicans challenging Republicans in their primary.
There's a few Republicans that are trying to create a circular firing squad where we spend all this money on primaries and then we get roasted in a general election with either a very poor candidate or a candidate that's been beat up unnecessarily by a Republican candidate who just wants to run to get attention for themselves.
Illinois' general primary election is scheduled for Tuesday, March 19th, 2024. Those are the top stories from the past week from Illinois. Find more online at americastalking.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square executive editor Dan McCaleb. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Breaking news, that's what the Center Square does best. The stories other media outlets refuse to report, the Center Square's breaking them all the time. Stories about government waste and political spending, stories about partisan agendas that hijack your tax dollars. The Center Square has it all covered and delivers the biggest news to your inbox as it happens. Sign up now for your state Center Square newsletters at thecentersquare.com. That's thecentersquare.com.
Welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, executive editor of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me again today is Greg Bishop, the Center Square's Illinois Capitol Bureau senior reporter and editor. How are you, Greg?
Oh, it's been hot and stormy this past week. Hopefully everybody is nice and cleaned up from the storms we got last week. But I know in Springfield, there's still people without power heading into the weekend.
Oh, wow, that's too bad. We did need the rain across the state. I think the farmers hopefully are happy with that after the drought we had in the spring and earlier this summer. Greg, we're recording this on Thursday, July 6th. I hope, despite all the rain, at least we got up in northern Illinois, Hope everyone had a patriotic and safe Independence Day holiday. Greg, you reported on just yesterday, I should say the Center Square, Illinois team reported on just yesterday, that the state has reached a deal with AFSCME union workers for state employees on a new contract. Tell us about it.
So we've got this thing that happens each and every 4 years with a new administration. The unions come together and negotiate on contracts for state employees who are part of their bargaining units. AFSCME just so happens to be the largest state union for state employees, so they get a lot of the oxygen in the room. And they come together with a new administration. When Rauner left office and Pritzker took office, there were new contract negotiations heading into the new fiscal year that started 6 months after he took office, and they had a contract. So they put that into place 4 years ago. Well, with this new state budget that started on Saturday, there should have been a new contract in place. But here we are on July 6th, heading into the weekend. The new contract is not quite yet in place, but it was revealed earlier this week that over the weekend, the holiday weekend, they did come to terms on a tentative agreement, meaning the terms are on the table and the union's going to take back the contract terms and vote on it to possibly ratify it and get it signed and implemented for the next 4 years. Now, the contract includes, of course, benefits ranging from pay increases to health care to other types of benefits, but we don't know the true scope of this and how much more it's going to cost. Just for a bit of perspective, for fiscal year, or rather I should say calendar year, the comptroller's office shows for 2022, the state spent more than $6 billion on payroll for state employees, all state employees across all agencies and executive branches, including the treasurer's office, the comptroller's office, and the secretary of state's office, and the attorney general's office, and all of the Pritzker administration agencies. So they spent more than $6 billion just in calendar year 2022. That was around $200 million more than was spent in the prior calendar year of 2021 of $5.8 billion. So the big question is just how much more is this new contract going to cost taxpayers? That has not been revealed. When the governor was asked about this earlier this week at an unrelated event, he simply just said, yes, we've got a tentative agreement, came together, he says, at the last minute, right as the new fiscal year was starting, and it's time for the union to then review the terms, but he did not want to reveal how much more of an increase in pay and benefits the taxpayers are going to be on the hook for moving forward with this tentative deal. Now, the big question, as we saw during the tail end of the budget negotiations for the fiscal year that starts July 1st, was about, is there going to be enough in the budget to cover any potential cost increase from this contract? Republicans were saying that the contract should be within the bounds of the budget, but they worry that the increase, which some speculated could be $300 million of an increase, could possibly go over the allotted budget, therefore spurring on conversations for more tax increases. So we have yet to see the actual numbers of how much more this is going to cost taxpayers, and that leaves a lot of unanswered questions on how the state moves forward, not just for this fiscal year, but for future fiscal years with expected rate increases for pay for each individual year.
I remember when there was debate on it or discussion on it during session, there was some concerns. For one, you had, you've had the year and a half of significant rising costs for inflation. Was that going to, you had Amendment 1 pass and go into place, was essentially placed in the Constitution, union members' collective bargaining rights. State law cannot trump that. So there was concern with Amendment 1 passing, with the new contract coming up, that AFSCME would hold out for significant cost increases. That prompted some Republican lawmakers to worry that there wasn't going to be enough in the budget, and Democratic lawmakers might come back after the fact and try and get a progressive income tax back on the ballot. At this point, though, you're saying we just don't know because the details of the tentative agreement have not been reached.
That's correct. Yeah, we haven't seen those details, not yet revealed. And once we do find those details, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of numbers being crunched and a lot more conversation to be had.
Because it's not just potential wage increases that could cost Illinois taxpayers. If AFSCME demanded better health benefits, for example, costs could go up there as well. So anyway, we'll be paying attention at thecentersquare.com. Greg, one thing that didn't get passed during the legislation was any reforms or changes to Illinois' very strict biometric privacy law that business groups say if they're found in violation, they could be out of that could put them out of business or force them into bankruptcy. The Center Square's Kevin Bessler wrote an update on this story this week. Tell us what's going on here.
Yeah, so the Biometric Information Privacy Act, it was enacted back in 2008. So we're talking, a good 15 years or so when this thing was implemented. And the thinking back then was that, there's biometric information that's unique to each individual, and that type of information like a fingerprint or a face or retinal scan. These types of things are unique to each individual. And back in 2008, the legislature passed and it was enacted the Biometric Information Privacy Act that would hold companies liable if they collect that type of information and store it without getting explicit consent from the individual that biometric information is coming from. So in 2008, it passes, and it seems like years go by before we actually started seeing lawsuits, sizable lawsuits being filed. But now we've got lawsuits stacked on top of lawsuits using BIPA, the Bioinformation Privacy Act, to go after companies that people allege are violating the act. So we've heard about the Facebook settlement, which was close to $500 for those who took part in the class action settlements. We've heard about Google and a variety of other social media companies, and those were sizable. They were tens of millions of dollars that cost these companies by settling out of court. But one case that really got attention of business owners was a case involving White Castle. And the employer, the burger chain, they were using fingerprints for people to clock in and clock out. And it was challenged in Illinois courts. And it went all the way through the process to where the Illinois Supreme Court actually upheld the law and it said that the General Assembly probably needs to come back and reevaluate this, because the ultimate costs of that was somewhere north of $17 billion. That's billion with a B. And that's an absolute bankrupting amount of money for even a company like White Castle. So we thought that the legislature was going to come back during spring session a few months ago now and actually amend BIPA. But while negotiations were going on throughout all of spring, you did not have any resolution, despite businesses saying these are the aspects we need to change. These are the things we need to update. But the legislature apparently couldn't come to terms with what the business community was looking for, and they adjourned spring session without addressing this. And here we are into the summer months, and it's going to be interesting to see if they do produce any substantive change that could alleviate the concerns whenever they come back for fall veto session.
When you talk about an award of over $1 billion, even a big company like White Castle, that's going to have a dramatic impact on business operations. And certainly I can't imagine lawmakers want this law to be putting people out of work because businesses can't afford it. So let's hope during veto session or they could also call, I guess, a special legislative session. But one way or the other, let's hope this gets addressed by lawmakers.
Well, even the Illinois Trucking Association is worried that they've got companies that are essentially just settling out of court to get away from any potential large liabilities. And with these lawsuits continuing to go forward without any changes in the law, they're possibly looking at millions of dollars in litigation costs. But you've also got another interesting case dealing with the BNSF Railway, where they were ordered to pay $228 million after truck drivers brought a class action suit over the policy of scanning fingerprints. And a judge actually vacated the award, but now it apparently is going to go to trial, which would mark the first case under BIPA to actually go to a jury. So a lot of action in just the past few weeks on this story. story. And again, we'll be watching closely to see what happens come fall veto session.
We sure will. And of course, Greg and his team at thecentersquare.com will be all over it as the story does develop. Greg, you've extensively covered Illinois' recently enacted, I say recent, I've been using recent, back in January, the legislature passed and Governor Pritzker signed into law a ban on more than 170 semi-automatic pistols and rifles. It included a ban on magazines of certain capacities. There were lawsuits immediately filed in both state and federal courts. Those lawsuits are still working their way, challenging the law on Second Amendment grounds, but also on other grounds. You've been following those court cases extensively, but this week on July 4th, Independence Day, the 1-year anniversary of the mass shooting at the Highland Park Independence Day parade, Governor Pritzker called for the Illinois ban to be taken nationwide. Tell us about this.
Yeah, so a lot of conversation about violent crime and mass shootings, and you see the regular stories out of Chicago. Seems like every weekend there's, a couple of dozen people shot, and 5, 6, 7, 10, 12 people killed. So we've seen those stories weekend after weekend, and it gets compounded when you hear stories not just out of Illinois with mass shootings like the Highland Park parade shooting from a year ago. But even this past weekend, you had some mass shootings in Philadelphia and elsewhere. So there's an interesting moment here after these horrible tragedies happen, where some politicians they discuss what they think are the appropriate ways to move forward with trying to curb this type of violence. And there's varying viewpoints, and I think that's a safe way to say this. But Governor J.B. Pritzker, he attended the Highland Park parade this year, and afterwards got in front of the cameras and talked about how we need to remember those who were lost. But he also talked about the suspect in this case, in the Highland Park case, and saying that we need to make sure that individuals like that can never get their hands on semi-automatic weapons. Then he went on to talk about how he passed and enacted a ban on semi-automatic weapons and magazine capacities over certain sizes. Then he said that that's not enough. He wants to see it done on a nationwide scale. But the White House also jumping on board with that idea. And this week, the White House press person said that they agree there needs to be a nationwide ban on semi-automatic weapons. But the gun rights advocates, including those suing the governor in federal courts, they say that's not the answer. The answer is not to go after law-abiding citizens' ability to purchase whatever semi-automatic firearms they feel they can protect themselves, their family, their property with. They say the answer is instead to look at other policies and other things that are driving this violent crime. And one in particular, Todd Vandermeide, he's with the Federal Firearms Licensees of Illinois, and he's consulting on a case that's in federal court right now at the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. And he said that gun control is not the answer. He said it's the other policies that are causing more rampant crime that the Pritzker administration's implemented, that Democrats in the State House passed, like no cash bail, like electronic monitoring for criminal detainees, like allowing those on electronic monitoring to have 2 days off to go and find, work or do anything else personal, which even Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart said needs to be reversed because they've had dozens of instances of people being arrested on that furlough. So there's a lot of other policies that people point to saying these are the reasons why there's increased crime. Others across the country debating mental health issues, debating the lack of a family structure in some cases, the lack of opportunity. So it seems that the conversation on how to curb violent crime is really split into two distinct camps. One saying go after the tools that are being used in these crimes, like semi-automatic handguns or semi-automatic rifles in the case of some mass shootings that have happened, while the other side says, no, it goes deeper than just the the firearm. It's a systemic problem with a whole host of other issues that don't get addressed whenever some just focus on one particular thing, like trying to ban weapons. So the governor made those comments this week, but the governor also this week was reacting to the court case that was heard last week in the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. And Governor J.B. Pritzker reacting to that hearing, saying that he is heartened by the questions that the judges asked on that panel in the Seventh Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. And on that panel, you had some of the judges asking about, missile launchers and grenade launchers, or just carrying around grenades. And the governor said, is this going to be a popularity contest, and what kind of guns are allowed? So he says, quote, if everybody has a missile launcher, then can we not ban missile launchers? And Todd Vandermeide reacted to that and said, this isn't about missile launchers. This is about commonly owned semi-automatic firearms that the governor banned, and that he says the U.S. Supreme Court has clearly said cannot be banned if they are commonly owned today. So again, you get down into the nitty gritty of the debate on firearm legislation, and it quickly turns into litigation where the question gets tied up in the courts. Now, what happens next with Illinois' gun and magazine ban? Will it be something that the entire nation takes up? With a divided Congress, that's doubtful. But the future of Illinois' ban likely is going to be determined by the U.S. Supreme Court. The big question is when. That's still a big unknown.
Well, thank you for your update on that, Greg. We have just a couple of minutes left. I want to talk about one more story this week. The next big election is not until 2024, but that's not stopping candidates from throwing their hat in the ring for things such as congressional seats. And I don't know if you were surprised by this, but I'll admit that I was. A former Illinois state senator and former Republican candidate for governor, Darren Bailey, threw his hat into the ring for Congress this week, but he's challenging a sitting Republican congressman, Mike Bost. What's going on here?
This really is going to be interesting to see how various primary elections play out as well, because we have a primary election for the private parties, the Democrats and the Republicans in Illinois on March, I believe, let me double check that date, the 19th of March, 2024. So that's coming around the corner here a lot quicker than I think people realize. So we're going to start seeing a lot of these various districts with potential challenges for both Democrats and Republicans. But for the congressional district in Southern Illinois, which is the largest geographic congressional district in Illinois, Mike Bost has held that seat for years. He's a conservative Republican, former member of the Illinois State House. You have this challenge coming in from Darren Bailey, who is looking to take on Bost in that Republican primary. And Bailey is trying to drive home the message that, he doesn't want a career politician there. He wants to work for the people, and he's working to bring conservative principles to Washington, D.C. So that's going to be fascinating to watch that unfold. But it also begs the question about internal Republican politics. And with the primary March 19th, 2024, how many other different types of challenges will we see? Now, I talked with State Senator Steve McClure. He is not up for election. He was elected to a 4-year term last November, so he's not up in the November 2024 election. So I think he has a little bit more freedom to discuss these things. But he did say that he worries if we have Republicans challenging Republicans in a primary, that could divide the party. It could also beat up whichever candidate comes out on top, possibly having to spend a lot of money in the primary, to where they then get into the general election with depleted campaign funds to possibly go up against a Democrat who could be well funded. So some interesting, if you were, strategies that are being discussed and possible outcomes.
Thank you, as usual, for all your insight into news in Illinois, Greg, but we are out of time. Listeners can keep up with all the stories we talked about today at thecentersquare.com. For Greg Bishop, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe. Thanks for listening.